I had to like have a meeting with the bus. I don't know what's their emission. And I was like, yeah. And I was like, yeah, that'd be my cycle. Like, I don't think that's what it means. And then some just like crazy framework. What it means is these things. Okay, well, it's like how do She's like, that's what I think. Just like let it slide. Just take what we can get, you know. Yeah.
All right, we got about a minute, so maybe we should. Okay. Everybody pick your seat. And I use that word like would they see too? You got my stuff there.
That was always the darkest.
That's Whitesburg, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Are these fresh? Yeah.
Oh yeah, I'll cover all those.
Oh, thank you.
Fresh. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Between us.
On my car, it was. And I said to the people who were open and discussing, I'm going to be on that panel, but if I was here, it's not a kosher.
I do it.
Yeah, totally. That's rowdy. Yeah.
City and state is what.
Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. One piece of housekeeping before we dive into the panel here. On the sign outside, it says fact or fiction, ammonia, nitrogen, and digesters. So this is actually the Clean Fuel Standards panel. That was just a mistake on the sign on the app and the website. It has the correct panel, but just in case someone saw that and was very interested, I hate to disappoint you, but this is the Clean Fuel Standards. So I hope you'll still stay with us and learn more about that. All right, well, to kick things off, good afternoon. My name is Jonathan Harding. I'm the manager of state policy for the American Biogas Council. This is the Driving Progress, Exploring Clean Fuel Standards. I'll be moderating the panel first. Thank you so much for joining us. I know it's 5 o'clock. There's some events this evening, so very thankful that you're here with us. Additionally, thank you for attending Biogas Americas. Hope you're really enjoying your time here and definitely finding value in the 2 days in Savannah. We got a great panel for you today. Our panelists here have a significant experience within the industry. I think you're definitely going to get value of hearing what they say on clean fuel standards at the state and federal level. To give you kind of a rundown on what we'll be covering today, we're going to start the conversation kind of looking at existing clean fuel standards. So we'll be looking at California, Washington, Oregon, those that have been in place. Then we're going to shift the conversation and discuss kind of emerging clean fuel standards, such as what legislation that's recently been passed in New Mexico, and then also kind of the legislative landscape across the country and seeing where that stands regarding CFS. We'll close out the conversation by touching on what's going on at the federal level in regard to a national clean fuel standard on the legislative and regulatory side with that. Also, we'll save time for questions at the end. We have a microphone right up here in the front. So at the end, when it's time for questions, feel free to walk up here and we'll be happy to answer those the best that we can. Now to go ahead and introduce our panel here, you can see the pictures and names here, but I'll give a quick rundown at everyone. Also, their bios are available on the app, the event app, as well as biogasamericas.com. So feel free to check those out if you want to learn more about our panelists. So starting on my right here, we have Peter Weisberg. He is Director of Development of 3 Degrees. We have Sean Wine to his right. He's Vice President, Renewables Distribution at Clean Energy Fuels Corporation. Then we have Rich Castle. He is partner at AJW. To his right, we have Shay Sahai, partner at Baker Botts, and also a Low Carbon Fuels Coalition board member. And then to his right, we have Jessica Bennett, who is partner at AJW. And AJW is very helpful there. They work with the American Biogas Council at the federal and state level on issues. Now that we have that out of the way, I think we're going to go ahead and dive into the conversation. So to kick off the panel discussion, we're going to start with existing CFS programs, what's going on there, the successes, outcomes, even some challenges that have been taking place. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Sean to kind of give us a rundown what's going on in California, LCFS, and everything there.
Can you hear me? Good. Okay, my assumption is most of you probably are aware of what's going on in California, besides the fact that the LCFS price is in the toilet at $45 a ton, unfortunately. But to give a quick rundown for those that might not know, this program has been very successful. It's probably one of the largest, most recognized, decarbonization strategy tool that's in any government across the globe. We've seen significant capital investment. I mean, CARB has statistics out there that over $4 billion is, make it a little closer. Around $4 billion a year is allocated towards it. And what we are currently in is an environment where the success of the program is ultimately, it's a double-edged sword, right? We have an influx, an oversupply of LCFS credits in the market. And as a result of that, the program is overproducing results, and we see a very rapid deteriorating LCFS price point over the past 2 years. CARB is in the process of going through the regulatory framework where they initiated some changes to the program. But a lot of people have been very concerned about that, including us at Clean Energy for various reasons. But we are in the final throes of what this regulatory framework is going to shape out to be. We expect to hear back, hopefully, from CARB that goes with their next recommendations and their changes, hopefully by July at the latest. We really need to see some direction from the Air Board and an adoption of the changes to the LCFS this summer. The fear is if you go past the summer, you get close to the election. And if you get close to the election, there could be, like anything, there's politics involved. And if we get too close to the election cycle, there could be politics involved and a slowdown or just put on hold any type of regulatory changes. So we're closely monitoring it. I know the ABC and this coalition that you're members of is very actively involved at that state level. There's consistent meetings with CARB and CARB staff about the program and trying to push for the appropriate changes within it. If the two biggest sticking items that have been impacting our industry is avoided methane crediting, right? That's how you get your ultra low negative carbon intensity CI score when you do your pathway modeling. CARB has originally they proposed to phase that out because that's what the environmental justice community has been asking for. They have retracted on a lot of that. And for the first time, I think that we're in a position where, as an industry, we're making a lot of good headway with CARB and at the staff level. They are a lot more amenable to keeping avoided methane crediting in the program. That's what they've proposed in the last documents that they sent out. Along with that, you have the book and claim issue. So the original plan that they pushed out, and I think it was November of 2022, would make deliverability requirements be a component of the low carbon fuel standard, And that meant that you'd have to demonstrate that your molecules were being injected and that you were delivering them with firm delivery requirements all the way from wherever it might be, New York to California. That's obviously not how the market works today. So what they've come back with and it said that deliverability requirements would not be a component of the LCFS for any project that gets built. And so if you get built by the end of 2029, you get grandfathered in the program. So that was a big win for us. So I say that from the context that we're in a very good spot from a negotiation standpoint with the Air Board, better than we've been before. And I think that's probably because staff is looking at the environmental justice community who has historically been a champion at CARB, who is now attacking CARB. And so I would like to just challenge anybody in this room to, if you have any boots on the ground in Sacramento, talk to Heather, talk to Jonathan. We need to make sure that we're all united with the messaging to go back to CARB to get them to really move forward faster. We need to make sure that this gets adopted this summer so that way we don't lose any more time. And I'll leave it at this final point, and if you have any questions, happy to answer them. If they don't get it approved by December, then you start the workshop process all over again. And so you lose a year, you go back, and now you say you're going to work on it in 2025, and any adoption that would occur would be in 2026. So we need to get this done quickly, and the CARB needs to be more aggressive with the curve, the compliance curve that they've outlined. They've said that they've originally a 5% step down in 25. They came back and said they've modeled 7% and 9% as well. So again, advocate for a 9% step down in the curve. That's the only way that we can really erode the excess supply of credits in the bank.
No, that's great, Sean. I was just going to add, one thing in regard to, we're talking about the regulatory side and then CARB, but, there's still legislative threats, that come, on a relatively yearly basis. And this year there was a bill that was going to remove the avoided methane emissions from the calculation of a CI score. But we were able to get that bill halted within the assembly. So there's still victories in that, but still threats on the legislative side as well. But so outside of California, Peter. So Peter, he lives in Oregon and has a little bit of I think LCFS can definitely take up a lot of time, but we definitely want to look at other programs as well.
Yeah, so with prices so low, it's easy to focus on the challenges, and I definitely want to do that. But I do think that this very encouraging news about continued avoided methane crediting for projects built before 2030, and then a window for projects after 2030 to continue to be credited for avoided methane is a big deal to the industry, and it's different than what was proposed. And so I think that is a real win here and something that continues to create the opportunity. In Oregon, we've also seen prices drop significantly and a big influx of renewable diesel come into the state. And so Oregon continues to be a challenge for a while there. The pricing was quite different than in California, and we do a lot of work with biogas to electricity projects, and we were able to take power to Oregon instead of California and take advantage of that increased pricing. It's not the same opportunity anymore. And I think that Oregon and California are facing a lot of the same big influx of credit supply and a need to deepen targets and increase demand in order to really bring prices back up. The other piece of encouraging news, I think, is Washington coming online. It's been a long time talking about new programs and new opportunities. And so it's very encouraging to see one come online and exist and be an opportunity. But it's been slow to roll out, especially slow to roll out for biogas pathways. We're still waiting for the window where we can apply for tier 2, the more complicated pathways in Washington. But again, it's we need expansion, we need more demand, and so seeing a new program come online is a big deal, I think. But we're undoubtedly facing challenges. The low pricing is really, really difficult. We do a lot of work with biogas to electric vehicle projects, and with prices falling in half or falling in a third of what they used to be, electricity projects can't yet generate RINs, and so they really depend on CFS revenue. We've seen a lot of projects that were moving towards development hit pause, basically, with eRINs not coming online and CFS prices so low. I think another challenge for RNG projects and clean fuel standards is just a lack of fueling capacity. We're seeing a lot of new supply get built and come online. We're not seeing CNG fueling grow in the same way. And so I think a consistent message I'm hearing here, and I want to echo, is that we need new markets, and that voluntary markets with corporate customers or utility customers, I think, are going to be a really important part of being an offtake market that encourages new projects to continue to come online and get built. And so I think we need to be really careful with a lot of the new guidance that we're seeing from 40B, 45V, and Z that are setting up requirements around deliverability, what's creditable, all of those things. I think those they set a standard for what we're going to look to as new markets come online. And so I think it's really important that we weigh in and make rules that allow for book and claim accounting, allow for projects to move among markets, all of those things. And that's going to be really important moving forward. So hoping to have a chance to talk a little more about voluntary markets too.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I want to go ahead and pass it down to Shay as well. Kind of give us a little bit of the interrelationship between LCFS and what's going on at the federal level and everything there.
Sure, sounds good. So, I mean, look, fundamentally, this LCFS program design has generated a lot of economic opportunity, right? So a lot of the business models that are represented in the room today have been at least partially enabled by these LCFS programs. And the key reason for that, and I think it's a key reason why people like LCFS programs, is this idea of fuel neutrality, which is really central to the LCFS concept. But what we've been seeing, obviously, over time is that, the administering agencies and even the legislatures that are passing these programs aren't necessarily fuel neutral, right? And so they're, tipping the scales in favor of one fuel or the other. And unfortunately, for some of the recent developments with biogas have been kind of disfavorable. So it'd be kind of tipping the scales away from biogas. I think it's up to the folks in this room to turn things the other way and make sure the regulators again, see the benefits of biogas and see how important it is to decarbonization of the economy. So, the federal tax credits, right, is particularly the 40B Sustainable Aviation Fuel Tax Credit and the 45Z Clean Fuels Production Tax Credit are essentially like riffs on LCFS programs, right? They aren't fully in the LCFS structure, but the 40B program, involves, plant by plant CI scores, and then the tax credit kind of scales with the CI, right? So kind of pretty much equivalent to an LCFS type program. The 45Z program is a little bit more complicated. It's a little unclear how it's going to be administered. The statute calls for a table of CI scores rather than plant by plant CI scores. It's not clear what the IRS is going to do with that. We'll find out later this year. But fundamentally, even there, you're assigning CI scores to fuels and then, rewarding lower CI behavior. So it's still pretty similar to an LCFS program. So again, in the abstract, that is good. But, in the recent 40B guidance that which is issued by the IRS, there was a lot of scale tipping that I think, again, it's probably not favorable to the folks in this room. The recent guidance established a choice, a kind of new choice for establishing CI values. The statute allows you to either use the CORSIA model or an alternative. The alternative that the IRS is adopting is a modified version of the Argonne National Lab GREET model, specifically designed for the 40B program. But it's got a lot of assumptions and things that are embedded in there. So you don't run it like a normal model. For example, it only allows for, I think, 7 pathways for sustainable aviation fuel to obtain a CI score under the GREET option. None of those involves biogas as a feedstock. So that's, automatically disfavorable. I mean, you can still go use the CORSIA model, but there's no American model that allows you to go and qualify and score biogas to SAF. RECs can't come from biomass or biogas-based electricity to reduce your CI. Only landfill gas RNG that's directly connected to to a fuel production facility can be used to reduce the CI of that facility. And there's a couple other examples like that, but all kind of things that aren't favorable. And I think, in an ideal world, if you're really trying to incentivize carbon reducing behavior, like why have all these limiting assumptions, right? If you're going to go have a CI verifier come in, audit your plant, and then say, well, look, these are the real CI scores, then why limit it in this way, right? And in the RFS program, a couple of examples. I don't want to drone on forever, but there's a lot of new requirements being put on obviously upstream entities, on biogas producers that didn't exist before. There's some fear that those are really burdensome and that are going to cause folks to drop out of the market as biogas suppliers. And then there's also a bunch of disfavorable assumptions that EPA is applying in the pathway context under the RFS in terms of methane leakage and the energy it takes to upgrade from biogas to RNG. Some estimates I've heard is that EPA is now applying kind of a 20 CI deduction from going from biogas to RNG as part of a pathway application, which can essentially crush your project if you're trying to get a new pathway under the RFS. So again, these programs are good, CI-based things are good, but there's a lot of advocacy we all need to do to make sure that these programs really recognize the value of biogas and encourage the most kind of carbon efficient behavior.
No, that's great, Shay. We appreciate that. So kind of now that we've kind of given an overview of existing programs and what's out there, I want to shift the conversation more to the state level. So earlier this year, New Mexico passed legislation for their CFS program. There are a number of other bills that have been introduced in states across the country. I'm going to turn it over to Rich to kind of give an overview of that. And Rich, I know you're a New York native, so we definitely want to do a kind of deep dive on what's going on in New York. But before that, what can you tell us about New Mexico and what's going on in other parts of the country?
Sure, happy to. As we were sitting here, I was trying to think, all right, as a New Yorker, can I come up with a Yogi Berra quote to kick it off? And instead, I came up with a Mark Twain one, which I'll get to in a sec. So just to frame what's going on, I think that we've got California, Oregon in place, Washington coming online, New Mexico passed its program in March, and we've got a half a dozen or so states in all regions of the country that are actively considering CFS programs: New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, Minnesota, Illinois, Michigan, Hawaii, and one that I'm forgetting right now, but it's in there. And they're all at different levels of consideration. But when you take all those different states and then you layer on top the basket of states that are using the Clean Air Act, Section 177, to adopt California's Advanced Clean Truck Rule, you end up with a group of about 22 states that are in some fashion tackling the issue of vehicle pollution generally and diesel pollution specifically, and doing it in a way that's driving fuels and technologies away from gasoline and diesel, away from fossil natural gas, and towards the renewable or bio-based or electric versions of those. And I think it's important to start there, because one of the things that Patrick said this morning was that it's important to recognize all the different benefits that everybody in this room brings to these conversations in terms of what biogas has to offer to a range of different policy problems and challenges that decision makers think about. And when they think about a CFS in New York or in any of the other states that we think about, they're thinking about it through the lens of how do I decarbonize transportation? How do I accelerate electrification? Because electrification is the buzzword of the moment, not biofuels, as we all know. How do I improve air quality if I'm in one of the many states that doesn't actually meet clean air standards? How do I improve public health? How do I do all of that in a way that brings benefits into low-income urban or rural communities, communities of color, tribal communities, and so on? That's what they're thinking about in all of these different places, and it's the thread that connects all the different states. So the states, I think, fall into three buckets, and the buckets help explain how well or less well their proposals will go to actually solving all of those problems. The first bucket are states that are basically taking the original California approach and saying, we're going to reduce carbon intensity of all our fuels and vehicle technologies by a certain percentage by a certain date. And then we're going to leave it to our agency to figure out how to strengthen the program over time. So that would be New Jersey, 10% reductions by 2030. It would be Illinois, 25% reductions in the first 10 years of the program. The second group are taking that model, but they're pushing it further because they see that California has already outperformed its initial 2030 trajectory, is already moving to be more stringent, more ambitious. And so they're adopting that. And that would be the New Mexico program that just passed, 30% reductions by 2040 being the later goal there. Michigan would be in that category too, 35% reductions by 35. The last group is my home state on the assembly side in New York, but also Minnesota, that are saying, no. We want to go all the way to 100% reductions in greenhouse gases, net zero by 2050. We've got climate goals to do that economy-wide. We want to do that in our state. What's really important here is that approach really gets at what's happening under the surface when environmental groups or environmental justice advocates say that they don't like the clean fuel standard. At heart, when they're saying that, they're hanging their hat on three things. Number one, they don't believe that it actually is going to get us to our climate goals. And for their evidence, they say, look at California. California only had carbon intensity goals out to 2030. See, they never get to 100%. Leaving aside the fact that California is so far outpacing the rest of the country and by every single possible metric, but they say, but the letter of the law, nothing after 2030 until they change the program. The second thing that the opposition says is that it will perpetuate fossil fuels. Now, the reason they say that is because some of the programs don't ever go down to net zero. And so they say, see, all Exxon has to do is buy some credits and they can keep selling their fossil fuels forever because the system never gets down to zero. The third is they say, well, what about the high carbon intensity biofuels that we actually don't like? We don't want those. We see that there's a role for low CI biogas. We see there's a role for low CI renewable diesel, but the system doesn't guarantee we're going to get that. And again, the states that are going all the way down to zero are effectively pushing out the high CI biofuels, just like they're pushing out the high CO fossil fuels. What's left is the lowest CI biogas, RNG, renewable diesel, and of course the electric vehicles. I mention this because as we think about how do we integrate what's happening across all these different states, I want to leave you with a thought, which is the Mark Twain quote, which is one of my favorites of his, which is never let the facts get in the way of a good story. The good story, the real story is California is showing that if you want to decarbonize transportation, if you want to improve air quality, if you want to improve public health, especially in low-income communities of color that have lived with diesel pollution for decades, if you want to really advance biofuels across the board towards the lowest carbon intensity versions of them, you need a program like a low carbon fuel standard to do that. That's what's going to create this market signals, it's going to create the revenue stream and so on. But if all you care about is you want electric vehicles in every driveway, then you can just say, well, look at California. It doesn't do any of those things because it stops at 2030. And that's what we're seeing in New York in the opposition. It's what we're seeing in other states too. I think we're addressing it by making these state bills as ambitious as possible, and ideally moving them all towards adopting zero emission goals by mid-century, or getting as close to that as possible. And I'll pause there.
Great. Oh, sorry. No, that's great. And also, you kind of touch on some of those challenges and things going on. And Sean, I know that you've been engaged in other states as well in regard to CFS. So what are I know maybe Illinois, Minnesota, Michigan, you've been engaged. And what are some of the challenges you're seeing as well in regards to, kind of boots on the ground, actually trying to move legislation there?
Well, for starters, I'd like to echo what Rich said. I mean, we're in an interesting climate, right? You have almost like an ideology, as we all know, that is being pushed forth by environmental justice, and I think that's one of the biggest challenges. Now, it might be in like New York. No offense to your home state, I think they're wackier than California in many ways.
None taken,
but
guilty as charged.
I mean, the notion that they want to just eliminate things just to be to zero, without having an actual plan or technology to get to zero, is ludicrous. And I think that we're seeing that's still the message, and that's still the story that they put forth in all these other states that are trying to develop. And I think that what some of the challenges that we've had in some of the other states, Illinois being one of them, is a lot of it's just around education. Right, that's a common theme that we talk about in the ABC. That we've got to do a better job educating people. We've got to do a better job, and I think Patrick hit on that this morning, of telling our story, telling how it helps the soils, telling how it helps water. Those are areas that we get attacked on constantly, right? I think that the best way that we can be effective is, and I don't know how ultimately to do this, but like, to me, we need the regulators to talk with these other states as well, right? We need to bring them to the table, because there's a knowledge gap on the regulator side where they don't know. They hear about these programs and this is what we want to do, because we want to decarbonize transportation. We want to help air emissions. We want to help these impoverished communities that has all this freight moving through it, but we don't know how to do it, right? And I think that's where the regulators from other states can do a better job educating them. I think we as an industry and as members that have business, ventures and are investing in these areas in these different states, we can do a better job. We also need to make sure we're collaborating with the different stakeholders, right? I think one of the areas that you see is that there might be differing opinions through the different stakeholder groups, but when you bring everybody together to try to collaborate and find common ground, I think that we've had a lot of successes. The LCFS state, California, is a perfect example of that, right? The agriculture community and the dairy industry is lock and step with the RNG and biogas industries, right? They are trying to advocate with everybody. And, Illinois is an example where we could use that too, right? There's a lot of agriculture in Illinois. There's some differing opinions at that state about how to proceed with the CFS program. So I would say that we need to figure out ways to better collaborate, and we need to figure out better ways to educate the regulators on the success stories, like Rich said, because if we can do that, then we'll as an industry will have much more a likelihood of successfully implementing a program like that. But with all that said, I think we all need to be mindful of the fact that no matter what we do, none of this happens overnight, right? So we are planting a seed, and we've got to constantly water it, because it's going to be a 2 to 3 year cycle for any of these bills. Right? New York's we're in year 5 now, and we'll probably go to year 6 ultimately, maybe 7, depending on how quickly we can get things going and get the opposition out of the picture.
Let's go 6 or less.
6 or less. Okay.
I'm good
Should we
there,
take
too.
a bet on that today?
Sure.
Okay. But we ultimately, at the end of the day, we've got to do more to get more state programs, because that opens up more opportunities for all of us in here.
Yeah, and just to kind of react to a lot of what you're saying, a lot of this is staying in the dialogue and reminding people of the opportunity to decarbonize, liquid and gaseous fuels until the right opportunity arises, right? So the kind of limits of electrify everything with only solar and wind are already beginning to manifest themselves, right? There have been some significant developments, and don't get me wrong, obviously electrification is going to be a big part of decarbonization, but there are limits, especially in the short run. There's not enough electricity, there's not enough supply chain materials, et cetera, right? We're going to hit that hiccup soon, and kind of all the groundwork that we've been doing, right, around educating people on the alternatives of kind of low carbon liquid fuels. I think all that work is going to pay off in the next couple of years, because I think we're going to have to pivot back in this direction and start emphasizing some alternative technologies aside from electrification only with solar and wind.
No, and I wanted to give Rich a chance to kind of discuss the status of New York, kind of what's going on there, because we do have a bill there that we've been working on. Rich has been great with communicating with lawmakers, trying to get this issue moved forward, and it's not an easy thing to do. So I wanted to, maybe not seven introductions we need, but maybe what's that looking like this year?
Well,
and preface it by saying, you
all right,
can't
Yogi
predict
Berra, it
legislation.
ain't over till it's over.
Yeah.
We've got an assembly bill that is that goes to zero, that has the full life cycle GREET analysis that we want. It's got all the different pieces, but it's sitting in a committee where the chair won't move it. I don't expect her to move it before the session ends June 6th. On the Senate side, they've passed it the last 2 years. There's draft amendment language kicking around that may happen or may not. The bet I have going with Sean is year 6 or less, because I'm not sure that I would make a bet on year 5, but I will make a bet on year 6.
No, that's great. I appreciate that. So, we've looked at existing programs. We've looked at states that have legislation introduced, emerging programs. So now we're going to kind of shift the conversation to the federal level and what's going on there. Jessica, I know there's some discussions going on at the federal level. No legislation has been introduced, but at least the conversations are being had, in Congress. So kind of what can you shed some light on what's going on there?
Sure. So I'm glad you prefaced it that way. There are conversations happening and have been happening for the past several years. I think as multiple states started to look at this policy, it started to make Congress sit up and take a look and think about harmonizing everything that's happening. Certainly stakeholders were starting to get concerned about having to, deal with a patchwork of 50 state laws. Not to say that a federal policy would preempt state policies, but something that would harmonize the policies across the board. And Shay mentioned something that I've heard a lot lately is that we've almost implemented a low carbon fuel standard at the federal level through tax policy. Unfortunately, all of the guidance is not harmonized, so there's a lot of disconnect there, but that has stimulated the conversation to a point where Mr. Tonko from New York has drafted legislation that he circulated almost a year ago. Well, it was a year ago. It was a year ago in June, so a few weeks shy of a year. He wanted to start the discussion and get input from stakeholders on what a federal clean fuel standard would look like. We can call it a clean fuel standard, low carbon fuel standard. It's all the same thing. I think Illinois is calling theirs a clean transportation standard. It all boils down to carbon intensity, and leveling the playing field, I think, is probably the most important thing that the stakeholders at the federal level are talking about. There are a lot of new technologies coming online that are not dealt with under current policy. We're seeing that with the IRS guidance and how the modeling works and what modeling needs to be used. And I know that was at the forefront of Mr. Tonko's mind when he started this discussion and wanted to really dive into this and think about policy at the federal level. Congress can't agree on what day of the week it is right now, so thinking that this is going to be something that happens right away is a fool's errand. This is a marathon, not a sprint. There's not been any federal formal policy introduced. There's no bill number. It's not something that there are co-sponsors of for or things like that. Another point I want to make really quickly is most people would assume a member of Congress from New York would not be concerned about a bipartisan policy, but Congressman Tonko is very concerned and wants to make sure that this is something that is a widely accepted policy across the aisle, that he has Democrats and Republicans who support something like this, and he wants to get input from all stakeholders from every facet before he introduces legislation in a formal way. So the conversation is happening. I expect that we might see another draft sometime in the coming weeks. Like I said, it's been a year since the first draft was circulated, and I know there's been a lot of iterations since then that have not been very public, that have just been taking the stakeholder input incorporating that into the document and then getting information back from legislative counsel, which is the attorneys. And they always somehow miss something in translation. So there's a lot of back and forth that has to happen before there could actually be a formal introduction of a bill. Fortunately or unfortunately, on the Senate side, Senator Padilla has decided to take the mantle and I think shepherd it on the Senate side. He is also, though, intent on making this a bipartisan effort. He'd like to have Republican support before he moves forward, but Congressman Tonko and Senator Padilla are working closely. So I expect whatever we'll see will be companion type legislation. There might be slight differences, as there always is, between the House and the Senate, but there won't be any drastic differences. And I think the most important point for this group is that it would level the playing field. It would be an apples to apples comparison. There's not going to be picking of winners and losers, one technology over the other. And I know that's been a concern as this administration has implemented some of their policies because they are picking winners and losers, unfortunately. So I think a policy like this could be a positive step forward for this industry and be a market driver. We've heard a lot about policy that drives the market and creates new opportunities. And I think that's what this would be intended to do. So I can pause there.
I'm going to throw a question right at you.
Yeah,
That's okay. This might be softball for you, but okay. So I think a lot of the folks who drafted, 45V or 40B or 45Z also thought that they drafted it in a pretty fuel neutral way. They went and they even specified the model that you were supposed to use. Yet the administration was like, well, you said that model, but we're just going to use this other model. So like, how much is that playing into your conversations, kind of trying to foreclose a future administration to kind of run astray one way or the other?
That's a great question. And I'm not sure we could ever insulate ourselves from the bureaucracy that is Washington, D.C. and the intent of Congress versus what the agencies translate that to mean. That's why I think this is going to be a years-long conversation. I don't think this will be something that happens overnight. I do think that this conversation around the tax credits, the modeling, and things like that have helped to lay the groundwork and helped some of these agencies like IRS understand this is rocket science. It's not something that they know how to do. It's not easy. And the modeling is something that is a huge, huge issue just across the board. There's a lot of disagreement as to what it should look like. I mean, we've seen that with the IRS guidance. It's not the same. There is no harmonization. So I think lessons have been learned from the IRA and the implementation of the IRA, which will be good. I hope that Congress can take those lessons and make something positive of that. But like I said, they can't agree on what day of the week it is right now, so who knows? But it will be a years-long conversation, and I think it will be important for everyone in this room to engage in the conversation so that policymakers understand the impact of what they're going to be proposing and how that will impact the markets, how that will impact individual facilities and things like that.
I do think that, the last 5 years or 10 years, we've been building the RNG industry on the back of CNG vehicles and transportation use. And it feels like we're starting to come up against the full capacity of that. And so I think one of the most important parts of clean fuel standards is not just what new markets can we create, but how can we take the rules that we've created there, this avoided methane accounting, the ability to use book and claim to deliver gas through the pipeline network. All those things are really, really important policy decisions that we have to make sure carry over to the next markets that won't be transportation related, but might be about hydrogen or SAF or just use of gas in industrial processes. All of these really hard to decarbonize things where RNG is going to be sent in 20 years or 30 years. I think it's really important that we take these rules from clean fuel standards and make sure that we're carrying over some of the flexibility that we have into these new systems that potentially have much bigger consumption of gas and are sure to demand renewable natural gas sort of well into a decarbonized future. And so it feels like we're at a bit of a critical moment right now where folks are starting to brainstorm new rules around first productive use or what kind of deliverability you can have. And it feels like it's important, CARB has really set a framework and a groundwork here. And I think it's really important that we point to it and attempt to build off of it rather than sort of starting anew and running the risk that we won't have access to these new bigger markets because of the ways the ways that the rules are written. So,
Rich?
Yeah, I think you've just hit on a super important point that I want to amplify because, you know, in New York, there is so much attention going on around the treatment of RNG, specifically biogas generally, in the CFS program that's being proposed. And we're not a state with a lot of natural gas vehicles. It's very hard to find a natural gas vehicle if you drive around New York. We've got 12 million cars, we've got 20 million people, and I don't know if we have 1,000 natural gas vehicles on the road at this point. We're not an NGV state. And yet, the treatment of RNG and biogas in the CFS is critically important because it sets the precedent for the treatment of biogas and RNG in electricity production, in how we're going to, you didn't mention buildings, but buildings are a huge issue in New York. We've got 20 million people and they all live inside. And natural gas is the predominant way that people heat their homes and the water they use in their homes. And the ability to decarbonize buildings is going to turn on whether or not we can figure out how do we use biogas in the building sector as well. And whatever we do in transportation is going to flow into what we're going to do in buildings. And the reason why advocates who are fighting against biogas RNG in the CFS, they're not doing it because they think that there's going to be suddenly an explosion of natural gas vehicles in the New York Thruway. They're doing it because they want to make sure that there's not a precedent that flows into the building sector where they want to electrify all the buildings. And that is something to keep in mind every time any of you are in a conversation that's about this. And I think Peter's really hit it on the head, that there's amazing opportunity ahead for you all in all of these different CFS states, but it's an opportunity that's broader than just what's the fuel that's going to be in a transit bus.
No, absolutely. So watching the time, we're going to open up for questions here in just a few minutes, but I did want to give one last question to the panel, just open it up to anyone. So what are we looking at as far as our biggest hurdle or biggest challenge getting more states to adopt CFS and also at the federal level?
I'll start with the federal level because it's an easy answer. We have an election happening in just a few months, so there's not going to be really any meaningful policy made before November, and then after November, it remains to be seen what the makeup of Congress looks like, who's in the White House. So I think the uncertainty that we're facing is probably the biggest hurdle, and just making sure that we're educating and continuing to educate and get your message out there about what's needed for this industry, what's needed to stimulate the growth. But it's definitely the politics of it.
Shay?
Sure. So, I mean, one fundamental issue is that in the current, I think, political environment, this isn't at the top of the things that voters care about necessarily. Like climate right now isn't at the top of a lot of people's minds. There's a lot of, perceptions of kind of weak buying power and a weak economy. You could point to, all sorts of statistics to counter that, but it is what the psychology of people is right now, right? And so kind of emphasizing a new regulatory program is not, maybe the number one thing that folks want to do. And on top of that, there's a perception that this is going to go and push up energy prices. So not only is it not a priority, it actually runs counter to what people are saying is their priority, which is bringing down the prices of things, right? And so I think that's a challenge. And then the second that Rich already talked about are these kind of these I think broader environmental goals that are not necessarily climate related and that are kind of being kind of cloaked as EJ, but often have nothing to do actually with the interests of low income communities. I think that's another kind of set of issues. The people flying that flag, even though it doesn't kind of fundamentally reduce their interests don't necessarily fundamentally reduce the cost of energy for low income consumers.
I agree. And to add another topic, I think that a major challenge is that we are trying to transition the entire economy towards a low carbon future. And for the most part, the dialogue around different advocacy efforts has been selling the notion that this is a cost-free way to do it, to behave as a society, and it's not. Whether to transition our power sector costs money, to transition our transportation sector costs money. And what I see as an opportunity here is that the CFS in New York is going to generate revenue from the fossil industry to decarbonize transportation, and that will make it easier for us to decarbonize in other sectors of the economy, because we're going to have an economy-wide cap and invest program. So if we do it right, the fact that we have a cost challenge turns into an opportunity where this becomes a way to help fund the investments that need to happen, not on the backs of ratepayers, but rather in traditional polluter pays type of policies, which I think is a winner. I'm going to win the bet, by the way. And you all will be here next year. We'll be in Denver, and you're going to help me collect. But I think the challenge is cost, and I think the opportunity is that this helps, this actually helps.
I kind of already hit on the collaboration and education, but I think that when you look at the opponents to any type of a clean fuel standard, and if you look at like California as the example, the more we can do to educate and tell the successful story of California, and specifically the biogas business, to legislators, the better of a chance we will have at getting a program implemented. The folks that have been against us, and you look at California with Senate Bill 709 from Allen, look at the geography of where they live. Senator Allen lives on the beach, and he was writing a bill to prohibit dairy and livestock from being included in the LCFS regulation. Why? He's answering to his constituents in the environmental justice community. What did the industry do? They took him to a farm in Central California. And what did he think? He was blown away. He was amazed to see how humane the cows were treated. He was amazed to see the solar farm that the farmers built next door to power his operation so he could have a closed loop and have circularity. And I think that's what we need to do more of. That's the challenge that we face in all of these states, is that if we leave it to the quote unquote opponents on the other side of the table that are just irrational actors, they will use bad stories, bad press, and bad evidence to kind of push against why our industry shouldn't be incorporated into CFS. On the federal side, I think this is an important part because it is conversational at this point. But I think we need to make sure that any type of a national program is not a replacement of the renewable fuel standard under our EPA. It needs to be a bolt-on and complementary to it, because if it is a replacement, could be a lot of unintended consequences there, especially on the landfill side of the business. And so we have to be mindful of that. And lastly, all of the transit buses in New York run on natural gas. And tomorrow at 9 o'clock in the morning, I encourage you, if you want to hear more about, because there's a lot of concern about the growth of the industry. There's a great panel tomorrow that will include Waste Management, Cummins, Paper Transport, which is a large Class 8 tractor carrier that works with a bunch of the major global shipping companies, as well as Dan Gage from the Transport Project, which represents the natural gas vehicle market.
Yeah, I think that, the challenge is just carbon pricing is hard. We've seen that. It's just difficult politically. You're putting the price front and center and saying we all need to pay this price. And that's not something people like to hear, and policy people really go to bat for. And I think we've seen in the Inflation Reduction Act and some other Green New Deal concept, it's an alternative model that is maybe less focused on the price and more focused on projects and benefits. And I think that's something for us to look to and learn, that those policies where we're seeing everybody subsidizing projects and not putting a carbon price front and center may have big benefits from a political economy perspective. So still, I think CFS programs are really important and provide a great model for us. And I think in climate communities, we can't do enough to talk about the methane benefits of these projects. I think more and more so the realization that we need to be doing everything we can to avoid methane right now is becoming clearer and clearer. And I think that's a clear pathway for the biogas industry to advocate for quick change here.
No, thanks.
Can I make one more
Yeah.
comment on the price side? So what would be good for the other states to hear too is, CARB has published a lot of data about fuel pump prices, and that there's been a lot of negative ads taken out in the past couple months because everybody knows there's a workshop and then CARB's going to make some adjustments. There's fear tactics right now about, oh, you change the curve, you do things on the LCFS, and your fuel prices at the California to go blow through the roof. And CARB has presented that data time and time again about the not a direct correlation on the price impact of the pump. So I think that's an area where we need to take that same information and use that with these other states.
No, thank you everybody for that. So we do have a few minutes left, so I do want to open up the floor to questions. We have a microphone right here, so if you have a question, feel free to come up and ask away.
Michael Grossman, my background, my agency built the Clean Fuel Washington digital program that helped pass the Clean Fuel Standard, and we're now doing the same in New Jersey and Hawaii. First, I want to echo what Sean said. There's a misperception that the environmental justice community means African American, Hispanic, and the problem is as much with lily white folks with postgraduate degrees who are ideologically rigid and insist that there's only one path to decarbonization. We've actually been successful, unlike a lot of groups who deal with environmental issues, because we actually talk to people who of color, and we're able to message that this has immediate health impacts, good health impacts for communities that disproportionately are impacted by diesel. We're also able now to talk about how the majority of diesel in California is no longer petroleum diesel, it's renewable diesel, right? There are a host of messages. The difficulty, of course, is that the opposition, whether they be white folks on the beach or folks who live in the inner city, they tend to be better organized. And where we've been able to put together grassroots advocacy efforts, we've been very successful because the polling shows, even amongst Democrats, people are far more pragmatic about decarbonizing than they are rigidly ideological. When you present the case of a curve versus waiting 20 years for the infrastructure to be built, they choose the former overwhelmingly, even people who are left of center. And the other thing to deal with that I don't think we've articulated well is clean fuel standards help pay for infrastructure, including charging stations for electric vehicles. So by opposing this, they're actually cutting themselves off at the knees, because unless there's a cap and invest program in your state, there's no other way to fund EV charging infrastructure. Anyway, thanks.
No, thank you. Do we have any other questions?
I'll take one. Hi, Simon Dowdy. I'm here with SHV Energy, Shay. We've met at ABLC, and I wanted to make a connection there. At ABLC, there was time spent on the Bold Goals initiative, and one word in particular that was put in, favorite word of the CEO of Futuria Fuels, which is I work for with SHV Energy on the renewable propane business. Instead of decarbonization, it's defossilization. And that word was put in place of decarbonization in that Bold Goals initiative. So if it is about the messaging, we can't decarbonize transportation fuels. We are trying to defossilize transportation fuels. That is much more attainable than decarbonizing. And I would urge that we put that in our messaging rather than this unattainable goal of decarbonization.
No, thank you for that. No, that's a great perspective. Go Got a couple minutes left, and yeah, question back there.
Hi, Nicolas Nouvel from RN Group. I have an actual question for the panel. It's about the BPA. So in Europe, we talk a lot about biogas or biomethane purchase agreement as a way to incentivize industry and to buy more biomethane and get that dynamic going. I was wondering, how does this translate in the US? Because I haven't heard a specific terminology or anything like this. Any way to get the industry behind the purchase of higher level of biomethane?
Well, look, I mean, so the kind of long-term purchase agreements for LNG is what kind of allowed that whole industry to develop, right? So it's kind of like a fledgling industry, and then folks committed in the long term. Mm-hmm. And certainly that's how that industry was then able to kind of build out, right? So I think I don't know if this industry has been developing in the same way yet, right? So I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I don't know the kind of inner details of all your business models. You can probably speak more to it, but I'm not sure, these kind of 5, 10, 20-year offtake agreements are kind of what people are building their business models around. I'm sure you guys would be open to that if they were a buyer. But when I turn it over to Sean here, he seems to have some input here.
Sure. The industry goes in waves, right? Like if you look at, number one, I would say we're not like Europe, so it's going to be a while before we get to that point. But if you look at some of the early workings of the industry, and I think Starley from Archaea mentioned this today, the original Archaea founders were able to build bankable projects and secure financing by doing long-term offtake agreements, right? Very similar to the power markets where you would sign a 15, 20-year PPA, you go develop a project, and you're off to the races, go get the capital, go do the next project. What we've seen in the RNG market is because the compliance programs have rapidly grown and you've seen higher RIN values, right? And you've also seen historically, unfortunately not right now, higher LCFS values. You've seen the market and like really on the equity side with capital investments get more comfortable with the volatility around compliance programs. And so it's less standard today to see long-term type offtakes under fixed prices. Most people are willing to ride the volatility of the compliance markets, where as that price rides up, your margin and your return on capital gets better and better. And in the absence of a high LCFS price, now we're in a different market again. Like we're kind of going backwards, where it's hard to develop projects at a $45 LCFS, right? And so I don't think we're going to see a market flip where you're going to need fixed prices under long-term agreements. I think we're kind of past that point, but everybody's willing to take merchant risk today on contracts and develop assets for the RFS as it stands today.
Yeah, I think part of the issue here, right, is credit price volatility. I mean, right now, right, RINs are the stable thing and LCFS credits are the unstable thing. But it wasn't that long ago that RINs were kind of in the toilet, right, and that LCFS, it was just reversed, right, 5 years ago. So with that sort of kind of variability in credit pricing, I think that probably presents a challenge to the business folks trying to do some of these long-term contracts.
It presents a challenge, and then it also changes the dynamics of the marketplace. I mean, Starley mentioned it. We are moving into a market where there's more consolidation that's occurring, and you're seeing more of the traditional energy players get into the space that have bigger balance sheets. And so because of that, I don't want to say we're an immature market, because I think we are a mature market, but we're not that mature. We're starting to see our market mature, where now you've taken, I don't want to say private equity money and sharks out of the program, but a lot of people ran into the program, and you could see it on the agriculture charts that Patrick showed this morning, where you saw lower development ag space, and then you saw a rampant rise of it, and that was because of the LCFS markets. And so people were getting into the LCFS markets to develop projects, because at a $75 MMBTU value versus buying fossil brown gas at $5, there's a ton of money in it. But when you see the LCFS values drop to 45, there's really not much money in it. And so I think the market is definitely in a consolidation mode, and the major, it's going to sort out a lot of the funny money that's been in the space for a while, because you have to have some confidence, a view of the space, and a balance sheet to stay in it for the long haul.
I do think though, U.S. companies they're called virtual power purchase agreements. It's basically a long-term agreement to buy electricity and the RECs from a project. Those companies then go sell the electricity on the market and retire the RECs to meet their corporate goals. I think it's a really substantial number. I think it's 20 or 30% of new renewables in the US last year were under one of these virtual power purchase agreements. And I think if this market does move towards voluntary, you could see something really similar for like a virtual gas purchase agreement, we're seeing utilities offer long-term contracts in the US today. And I think corporates under this virtual gas purchase agreement structure could be another option that it would be very different than the market and how it mostly works today. But I think is a lot of opportunity to build new projects and is already sort of a well-worn path for corporates meeting renewable energy goals. So, yeah.
Yeah, especially
Jay, I'll let you button it up. We're right at time, but I do want to let you finish your statement.
Okay.
Yeah.
Itching for this one. But I think the voluntary markets are especially promising in markets where there isn't a compliance market, right? So there's in the thermal space, the non-transportation combustion space, there's obviously a lot of opportunity for credits, for these voluntary credits. And then you touched on the fact that methane is also a pretty useful feedstock for other processes, including not transportation chemicals. And so there, again, there's a big opportunity for voluntary markets in that space. And ironically, those markets might end up being more stable than compliance markets, right? Because you could end up with kind of well-financed buyers who are trying to be green, who end up entering into voluntary agreements for fixed prices, where you don't see that in these compliance markets.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. So as you can see, there's a lot going on in the state, federal level existing programs, programs coming online, as well as the legislation out there. So thank everyone for attending, and let's give our panelists a big round of applause.